Before cities existed, before streets had names, before light could be switched on at will, human nights followed a very different rhythm. There were no bedrooms, no clocks, no schedules separating day from night. Darkness was not something to escape. It was part of the environment people lived within. Human experience of night was shaped by fire, temperature, safety, and the movement of the group. Sleep was not organized by hours. It adjusted to sound, weather, and the presence of others. Archaeology and anthropology suggest that early human sleep was flexible rather than fixed. People rested in shorter phases. They woke easily. They remained alert even while resting. The night was not empty time. It was a condition that required awareness. In this world, darkness limited vision, but it did not stop activity. Fire provided warmth and light, and it also became a center for gathering. Silence carried meaning. So did distant sounds. The night required attention rather than withdrawal. What can be known about prehistoric life comes from physical remains, environmental evidence, and comparisons with societies whose rhythms developed without artificial light. The focus here is not on events, but on routine, not on conflict, but on continuity. How did humans rest when walls did not yet divide inside from outside? How did they remain safe when sleep itself was a vulnerable state? How did the night shape awareness before it became something controlled by light? These questions belong to daily survival. Tonight, the human night is considered before cities gave it shape, before time gave it structure, and before technology gave it control. This is not a story of progress. It is a study of rhythm, a history of rest in a world without schedules. For most of human history, night was not an interruption of life. It was one of its regular states. Half of every day passed without sunlight. There was no alternative light source capable of replacing it. Darkness was therefore not exceptional. It was expected. In prehistoric environments, human activity adjusted to this condition rather than resisting it. Movement became limited. Vision narrowed. Attention shifted from distance to proximity. The absence of light did not create total stillness, but it reduced unnecessary motion. Tasks that required precision or speed were no longer practical. What remained was presence. Human perception changed with the light. During daylight, the eye guided behavior. At night, hearing and touch became more important. Orientation depended less on sight and more on memory of space. This shift was not cultural, it was physiological. The human body evolved in a world where night was unavoidable. Sleep did not occur in sealed rooms or protected interiors. Rest happened within the same landscape where daily life unfolded. Darkness in this sense was not a separate realm. It was the same environment under different conditions. There was no clear division between inside and outside. No fixed boundary between activity and rest. Instead, there was a gradual transition from movement to stillness, from awareness to reduced awareness. Night was not treated as lost time. It was simply another phase of the cycle that governed food, movement, and survival. In such conditions, rest did not begin at a specific hour. It followed light, temperature, and fatigue. The natural world determined when human attention could withdraw. Darkness did not signal danger by itself. It signaled change. For most of human existence, the setting of the sun marked a clear environmental shift. There was no switch to reverse it. Artificial light, as it is known today, is a very recent development. For prehistoric communities, once daylight faded, visibility declined rapidly. The landscape became narrower. Details disappeared. Human activity adjusted accordingly. Work that required coordination or long-distance movement slowed. Paths that were clear during the day became uncertain. Open terrain turned into shadow. Without consistent light sources, people relied on memory of space. They remembered where stones lay, where the ground dipped, where shelter had been arranged. The world did not vanish in darkness, but it changed scale. Distance lost clarity. Near space became more important than far space. Anthropological research on traditional societies living without electricity suggests that evening routines were gradual rather than abrupt. There was no strict moment when night began. Instead, activity decreased as light decreased. Human vision is limited in low light conditions. Color fades. Edges soften. Movement becomes harder to detect. In such an environment, caution naturally increased. Steps became slower. Voices quieter. Artificial light allows modern life to continue almost unchanged after sunset. In prehistoric conditions, this continuity did not exist. The day ended because the environment changed and human behavior followed. The controlled use of fire marked one of the most significant transitions in human history. Archaeological evidence suggests that hominins were using fire regularly at least 400,000 years ago and possibly earlier. With fire, night no longer meant complete darkness. Fire did not eliminate the night, it reshaped a small portion of it. The light produced by a hearth was limited in range. It illuminated faces, nearby ground, and immediate surroundings. Beyond that circle, darkness remained intact. Yet within this small radius, important changes occurred. Fire provided warmth in colder climates. It allowed food to be cooked, increasing digestibility and caloric efficiency. It also offered a measure of protection against predators who tended to avoid open flames. But fire did more than solve practical problems. It extended wakefulness. Anthropological studies of communities that maintain traditional fire use suggest that evening hours around the hearth often became periods of quiet social interaction. Speech slowed, movement reduced, attention turned inward and toward one another. The circle of light created a temporary boundary. Inside it, visibility was restored. Outside it, the environment remained unknown. This division shaped behavior. Humans did not attempt to flood the landscape with light. They gathered near its source. Fire did not transform night into day. It created a small, shared space within darkness. Within that space, rest could begin gradually, not in isolation, but in proximity. The light produced by fire was not expansive. It did not reach the horizon. It did not remove uncertainty from the landscape. It formed a boundary. Within that boundary, faces were visible. Hands could move with precision. Food could be prepared. Tools could be adjusted. Beyond it, the world remained indistinct. This contrast between illuminated space and surrounding darkness structured nighttime behavior. People stayed close to the source of light. Movement outward was cautious and limited. The circle of light was not only practical, it was spatially meaningful. Inside the illuminated area, there was temporary clarity. Outside it, visibility dropped sharply. Shadows deepened. Distance dissolved into obscurity. This created a layered perception of the environment. The immediate space felt defined. The outer space remained present but unreachable. Anthropologists studying small-scale societies without modern lighting have observed that night gatherings often take place in compact formations. Bodies cluster, voices lower, movement narrows. The circle of light encourages proximity. It also reinforces awareness of what lies beyond it. Night, in this context, is not an absence. It is a surrounding condition. The fire does not conquer it. It marks a temporary center within it. Rest begins near that center. Not because darkness disappears, but because a stable point has been created within it. In low-light conditions, human perception shifts. Vision becomes less reliable. Details blur. Depth is harder to judge. Movement is more difficult to detect. As sight diminishes, other senses become more active. Hearing sharpens. Subtle sounds carry greater significance. The crack of wood in the fire, the movement of wind through grass, the distant call of an animal all demand attention. In prehistoric environments, this shift was not dramatic. It was routine. Darkness required a different kind of awareness. Rather than scanning large distances, attention focused on the near environment. Rather than constant movement, stillness became advantageous. Anthropological research suggests that in societies living without artificial light, nighttime alertness remains present even during rest. Sleep can be lighter. Waking occurs more easily. Individuals remain responsive to sound. This does not mean constant fear. It reflects adaptation. The human nervous system evolved in landscapes where vulnerability increased after sunset. Total disengagement from the environment would have been risky. Darkness, therefore, did not eliminate awareness. It reorganized it. The body reduced movement, but it did not fully withdraw. Silence at night was not empty. It was information. Every sound carried context. Every absence of sound carried meaning. In such conditions, rest developed alongside vigilance, not as opposites, but as overlapping states. Fire did more than provide warmth and light. It gathered people into proximity. Archaeological findings from prehistoric hearth sites often show repeated use of the same central area. This suggests that fire was not placed randomly. It became a focal point of shared space. At night, when visibility narrowed, closeness increased. Individuals sat or rested within reach of one another. Physical distance shortened. Voices softened. Movement slowed. Anthropological studies of traditional fire-based societies indicate that evening hours often involve quiet interaction rather than intense activity. Conversation tends to become reflective. Storytelling may occur, but it is not always animated. Silence is common and unremarkable. The fire provides a visual anchor. Faces remain visible. Body language remains readable. Beyond that small illuminated circle, darkness surrounds the group. This spatial arrangement reduces isolation. Sleep in prehistoric conditions was rarely solitary. Rest occurred near others. Safety was reinforced by presence. The human nervous system responds differently in proximity to familiar individuals. Heart rate lowers. Stress decreases. Alertness remains, but tension softens. In this way, fire reshaped not only the environment, but the social structure of night. Darkness outside the circle did not disappear, but inside it, a shared center formed. Rest emerged gradually within that shared space. Rest in prehistoric settings did not begin with a fixed ritual. There were no designated bedrooms, no assigned hours. Near the fire, the transition from wakefulness to rest was gradual. As evening progressed, movement decreased. Voices lowered. Tasks ended, not because a clock demanded it, but because light and temperature changed. The fire provided warmth, but it also required maintenance. Fuel needed to be added. Flames had to be monitored. This created intervals of partial wakefulness. Sleep, therefore, was rarely continuous. Anthropological comparisons suggest that in non-industrial societies without artificial lighting, sleep often occurs in segments. Individuals may drift into light sleep, wake briefly, and return to rest. This pattern does not indicate disturbance. It reflects environmental responsiveness. Near the fire, bodies remained close. Physical proximity reduced heat loss and increased security. Awareness did not disappear entirely. The human brain retains the ability to detect important sounds even during sleep. In prehistoric conditions, this sensitivity would have been adaptive. Rest was not complete withdrawal. It was moderated disengagement. The glow of embers, the shifting of bodies, the occasional crack of wood formed part of the night's rhythm. Sleep did not isolate individuals from their surroundings. It occurred within them. Near the fire, rest emerged slowly, shared, partial, and responsive. Darkness did not only limit visibility, it structured behavior. When light faded, the range of safe movement narrowed. This narrowing was not imposed by rule or instruction. It emerged from the environment itself. In prehistoric landscapes, orientation during the day depended heavily on visual markers. Terrain, vegetation, distant landmarks. At night, these references weakened or disappeared. As a result, movement slowed. Decision-making became more deliberate. The environment encouraged stillness. Darkness also defined boundaries. It indicated when certain tasks were no longer efficient. It signaled when gathering closer together was preferable to dispersal. It marked the transition from outward activity to inward focus. The human circadian rhythm evolved in direct response to cycles of light and dark. Melatonin production increases in low-light conditions, encouraging rest. This biological process aligned naturally with environmental change. Night, therefore, was not a passive interval. It actively shaped human timing. Without clocks or written schedules, the alternation between light and dark served as the primary organizer of daily life. Darkness oriented attention inward, toward the immediate group, toward bodily sensation, toward reduced motion. It did not erase the world. It redefined how the world could be approached. In this way, night acted as a boundary and a guide, not by command, but by condition. As night structured space and slowed movement, another pattern became visible. Rest was rarely solitary. In prehistoric environments, safety did not depend on walls. It depended on proximity. Darkness reduced distance. Fire created a center. But protection emerged through presence. Human sleep evolved in groups, not by coincidence, but by necessity. From this point, night becomes less about light and more about arrangement. Who rests first? Who remains alert? How bodies position themselves, and how vulnerability is shared. For most of human history, sleeping alone would have increased vulnerability. Prehistoric environments offered no enclosed rooms, no doors, no controlled boundaries between interior and exterior space. Rest occurred within the same landscape where movement, hunting, and gathering had taken place during the day. In such conditions, isolation carried risk. Predators were active at night. Temperature dropped, visibility declined. The body, during sleep, reduces voluntary control and slows response time. From an evolutionary perspective, complete solitude during rest would have reduced chances of early warning. Group sleeping provided a practical advantage. Multiple individuals meant multiple points of sensitivity. Even during light sleep, the human brain remains responsive to sudden or significant sound. When several people rest together, small disturbances are more likely to be detected. Anthropological research among small-scale societies suggests that individuals often sleep within close range of kin or familiar group members. Distance is minimal. Separation is uncommon. This arrangement is not primarily emotional, it is structural. Shared rest distributes vulnerability. If one person shifts or wakes, others may become alert. If one detects a threat, the group responds more quickly than an individual could alone. In this way, sleep was not a private withdrawal. It was a coordinated state. Solitary rest became common only after architecture created separation. Before walls, proximity was protection. Sleep in prehistoric settings was unlikely to be uniform across a group. While some individuals rested, others may have remained partially alert. This pattern does not require formal coordination. It can emerge naturally from variation in fatigue, age, and sensitivity to sound. Research in evolutionary anthropology suggests that in small groups, complete simultaneous deep sleep would have increased collective risk. Instead, lighter and staggered sleep phases would have been advantageous. Even without assigned roles, human sleep cycles differ slightly from person to person. One individual may enter deeper sleep while another remains in a lighter stage. As sleep phases shift, awareness rotates through the group. This creates what researchers sometimes describe as collective vigilance. No single individual carries responsibility for the entire night. Attention moves quietly from one body to another. If a sound occurs, a shift in the wind, movement in nearby brush, someone is more likely to notice. In such conditions, night does not require constant wakefulness. It requires distributed sensitivity. Anthropological comparisons with contemporary hunter-gatherer communities show that nighttime awakenings are common and not treated as disturbances. Individuals may briefly rise, adjust position, tend to embers, or listen, then return to rest. These brief intervals form part of the rhythm of group sleep. Vigilance was not organized by command. It was embedded in variation. Rest and alertness overlapped, and through that overlap, the group remained protected. In prehistoric environments, temperature was not controlled by architecture. There were no insulated walls, no enclosed heating systems, no barriers separating the body from the night air. After sunset, temperatures often dropped significantly, especially in open landscapes or higher elevations. Maintaining body heat became essential. Proximity provided a simple and effective solution. When individuals rested near one another, heat loss decreased. Human bodies generate warmth continuously. Shared space reduces exposure and stabilizes temperature. This pattern is observed not only in humans, but in many social mammals. Clustering conserves energy. In colder climates, archaeological findings suggest that hearths were central, with sleeping areas arranged around them. Bodies likely positioned themselves in ways that maximized warmth while minimizing exposure to wind. Physical closeness was not always a matter of preference. It was environmental adaptation. Anthropological studies of communities living in minimally constructed shelters show similar arrangements. Family members or group members sleep in compact formations. Distance between individuals remains small. This proximity reduces not only heat loss, but also physiological stress. Familiar presence stabilizes breathing and heart rate. The nervous system relaxes more easily in trusted company. Warmth and security overlap. In such conditions, rest was not spatially isolated. It was thermally and socially interconnected. Heat moved between bodies, and through that exchange, energy was preserved. Sleep places the human body in a state of reduced control. Muscle tone decreases. Reaction time slows. Conscious monitoring of the environment fades. In open prehistoric landscapes, this reduction in control increased exposure. There were no secure enclosures, no reinforced barriers separating the resting body from the surrounding environment. Night amplified uncertainty. For this reason, vulnerability was not managed individually. It was distributed. When a group rested together, no single body carried the full burden of risk. Exposure was shared across proximity. Anthropological evidence suggests that in small-scale societies, sleeping arrangements often reflect kinship bonds and long-standing familiarity. Trust reduces physiological stress, making rest possible even in uncertain conditions. Vulnerability becomes tolerable when it is collective. The presence of others allows deeper relaxation than isolation would permit. If one individual wakes suddenly, the disturbance rarely remains isolated. Awareness spreads. This diffusion of responsiveness transforms sleep from a solitary state into a coordinated condition. Rest does not eliminate risk. It redistributes it. Shared vulnerability also reinforces social cohesion. To sleep near others is to rely on them, to be relied upon in return. In prehistoric settings, this mutual dependence was not symbolic, it was structural. Sleep, therefore, was not merely biological recovery, it was participation in a network of protection. The group did not remove danger, it absorbed it together. In darkness, sound gains prominence. When vision is limited, hearing becomes the primary channel of environmental awareness. Even subtle changes in sound can alter perception. In prehistoric settings, nighttime noise was rarely ignored. The crack of cooling wood, the movement of an animal in brush, the shift of wind direction, each carried information. When individuals slept in groups, sound did not remain private. A small movement by one person could influence others nearby. If one body adjusted position, if one individual inhaled sharply or rose briefly, the change could ripple outward. Anthropological observations among contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that nighttime awakenings are often quiet and brief, yet rarely unnoticed. Awareness spreads gradually rather than abruptly. This diffusion of attention does not require speech. It operates through shared sensitivity. The human brain remains responsive to significant auditory stimuli during sleep. Research in sleep physiology shows that familiar sounds are processed differently from unfamiliar ones. This selectivity allows rest without complete disengagement. In group sleeping environments, this mechanism becomes collective. A sound detected by one individual may lead to slight shifts in others. Without formal coordination, the group synchronizes. Night, therefore, is not silent in meaning. It is structured by signals. Through sound, the group remains connected. Even while resting, awareness circulates quietly, moving through bodies within the dark. Modern sleep is often expected to be continuous. A single, uninterrupted block of several hours is considered ideal. However, historical and anthropological evidence suggests that this pattern is relatively recent. In environments without artificial light, sleep frequently occurs in segments. Research conducted in communities living without electricity has shown that individuals often fall asleep a few hours after sunset, wake naturally during the night for a period of quiet wakefulness, and then return to sleep before dawn. This biphasic or segmented pattern does not indicate disorder. It reflects alignment with environmental cycles. In prehistoric contexts, similar rhythms were likely common. Night did not demand immediate and sustained unconsciousness. Instead, rest unfolded in phases. Light sleep, brief awakenings, repositioning, tending embers, listening. These moments formed part of the night structure. The absence of artificial light allowed melatonin production to follow natural patterns, influenced by seasonal variation and latitude. Longer winter nights likely extended total rest time, while shorter summer nights compressed it. Sleep was flexible. It responded to temperature, fatigue, group activity, and environmental sound. Rather than separating wakefulness and sleep into strict opposites, prehistoric rhythms allowed them to overlap. Awareness softened but did not disappear. Rest deepened but did not isolate. Segmented sleep was not a problem to solve. It was an adaptive pattern, consistent with the environment in which humans evolved. Before permanent structures became common, rest still followed spatial order. There were no fixed bedrooms, no assigned rooms separated by walls. Yet sleeping arrangements were not random. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric sites shows repeated use of specific hearth-centered layouts. The fire often occupied a central position. Around it, space was organized in patterns that suggest habitual placement of bodies and materials. Even without architecture in the modern sense, structure emerged. Individuals likely positioned themselves according to age, kinship, or role within the group. Those more physically capable may have rested nearer to outer edges. Children and more vulnerable individuals may have remained closer to the center. This arrangement was not formally recorded. It did not require written rules. It developed through repetition. Anthropological research among contemporary small-scale societies demonstrates similar spatial tendencies. Sleeping positions often reflect relational bonds and practical considerations simultaneously. Proximity to fire provided warmth. Proximity to trusted individuals provided security. Over time, these patterns created a recognizable nighttime layout. The group formed a structure without walls. Space became socially defined rather than physically enclosed. In this way, rest was organized through relationship rather than architecture. The night had shape, even without buildings. Arrangement replaced enclosure. And through arrangement, stability emerged. Patterns of rest do more than restore the body. They shape relationships. When sleep occurs collectively, roles begin to stabilize. Those who remain alert more easily may gravitate toward outer positions. Those requiring greater protection remain nearer to the center. Children rest close to caregivers. Elders remain within reach. Over time, repetition creates expectation. Nightly arrangements reinforce bonds of trust. Dependence becomes visible. Responsibility becomes shared. Anthropologists note that in small-scale societies, daily structure often reflects patterns first established through proximity and cooperation. Sleeping positions can mirror kinship ties and social alliances. The organization of rest, therefore, is not separate from social organization. It participates in it. To sleep near someone is to acknowledge reliability. To be placed at the perimeter is to accept vigilance. To remain at the center is to be recognized as needing protection. These roles are not formalized, yet they carry weight. In this way, night contributes quietly to the development of social order. Rest becomes a rehearsal of structure. As human groups moved across landscapes, following seasonal routes, tracking food sources, adjusting to terrain, these sleeping patterns traveled with them. Before villages fixed space permanently, arrangement created stability. From shared rest, a framework of relationship emerges, and with movement across land, night begins to follow a different rhythm. For much of prehistory, human communities did not remain in one location permanently. Archaeological evidence from Paleolithic sites indicates repeated movement across landscapes, often following seasonal patterns of animal migration, water availability, and plant growth. This mobility was not random. It reflected environmental knowledge. Groups traveled within known territories, returning to favorable areas at certain times of year. Temporary camps were established, used, and then abandoned. In such conditions, permanence was rare. Shelter, when constructed, was lightweight or quickly assembled. Material culture was limited by the need to transport it. Possessions were practical and portable. This movement shaped daily rhythms. Rest did not occur in fixed rooms. Sleeping areas changed with terrain. The environment itself became the primary constant. Mobility also influenced timing. Travel often began at first light. Routes were planned according to distance and resource location. Evening arrival at a suitable resting place depended on daylight remaining. Anthropological research among historically nomadic societies suggests that familiarity with territory reduces uncertainty. Although camps shifted, the broader landscape was well known. Night, in this context, was experienced repeatedly in new physical spaces, but within a remembered geography. Mobility did not produce instability. It produced flexibility. The night did not belong to a single place. It moved with the group. Rest became part of a cycle of departure and return, rather than attachment to walls. In mobile prehistoric societies, shelter was often temporary. Archaeological remains from Upper Paleolithic camps show evidence of light structures, arrangements of wood, hide, or stone, designed for short-term use. These constructions provided partial protection from wind and precipitation, but they were not permanent dwellings. In many cases, natural features offered the primary defense. Rock overhangs, shallow caves, clusters of trees, or elevated ground were selected strategically. Location mattered. Proximity to water, access to food sources, and visibility of surrounding terrain influenced where a group rested. Yet even with careful selection, enclosure was limited. The boundary between interior and exterior remained porous. Night air circulated freely. Sound travelled without obstruction. Sleeping without permanent shelter required adaptability. Bedding materials were minimal: animal skins, grasses, or woven mats when available. These insulated against cold ground, but did not separate individuals from the landscape. Anthropological comparisons suggest that in similar conditions, rest remains closely aligned with environmental change. Wind direction may alter sleeping position. Rain may prompt repositioning under natural cover. Shelter did not remove the environment, it moderated it. Without thick walls or controlled climate, night remained present. The body responded directly to temperature shifts, humidity, and sound. Sleep occurred not in isolation from the world, but within it. Protection was partial, and awareness remained close to the surface. In many prehistoric contexts, the sky itself formed the upper boundary of rest. When shelter was temporary or partial, individuals often slept in direct relationship with open air. The absence of a constructed ceiling did not imply exposure without awareness. It meant that night was experienced without separation. Moonlight, when present, altered visibility. Under a full moon, the landscape remained partially legible. Shadows lengthened but did not disappear into total obscurity. During new moon phases, darkness deepened. Stars became more pronounced. Across different regions, prehistoric communities would have observed consistent celestial patterns. Although systematic astronomy developed much later, repeated exposure to the night sky allowed recognition of cycles, lunar phases, seasonal star positions, the gradual shift of constellations across months. The sky functioned as more than backdrop. It structured perception of time. Sleeping beneath open air also meant that weather conditions were immediately felt. Cloud cover changed temperature, wind direction altered sound, rain transformed ground conditions. Rest remained linked to environmental awareness. Anthropological research suggests that in societies accustomed to outdoor sleeping, the night sky becomes familiar rather than abstract. It is not distant, it is immediate. Without walls overhead, attention does not withdraw fully from the larger environment. The body rests beneath movement of stars, of air, of changing light. The sky does not close the day, it continues it in another form. Prehistoric nights were not experienced in a single type of landscape. Human groups occupied forests, open grasslands, coastal regions, river valleys and mountainous areas. Each terrain altered the conditions of rest. In dense woodland, sound travelled differently. Leaves absorbed movement. Wind filtered through branches. Visibility was limited even during daylight, and at night the sense of enclosure increased. On open plains, the horizon extended widely. Movement could be detected at greater distances, but exposure to wind and cold intensified. There was little natural barrier against shifting weather. In coastal regions, the rhythm of water became constant background sound. Tides and wind shaped temperature and humidity. Salt air affected materials and skin alike. Mountain environments introduced elevation changes. Cold intensified after sunset. Shelter had to account for slope and runoff. Rest adjusted accordingly. Sleeping positions changed depending on ground stability. Camp placement considered drainage, wind direction, and access to resources. Terrain shaped where fire could be safely maintained. Anthropological studies of mobile communities demonstrate that familiarity with land reduces unpredictability. Groups learned how each environment behaved after dark. Night, therefore, was not a single experience. It varied with geography. The human body did not impose uniform habits on diverse landscapes. It adapted. Terrain structured the night, and the night shaped rest in return. In prehistoric environments, night was not constant throughout the year. The length of darkness shifted with latitude and season. Winter nights extended, summer nights shortened. Without artificial light, these changes directly influenced patterns of rest. Long winter evenings allowed for extended periods of reduced activity. Cold temperatures encouraged closer proximity and longer intervals near the fire. Melatonin production increased with prolonged darkness, supporting deeper and more sustained sleep phases. In contrast, summer brought abbreviated nights. Warmer temperatures reduced the need for clustered warmth. Evening light lingered, delaying the onset of full darkness. Anthropological observations in non-industrial societies suggest that sleep duration varies seasonally. Total rest time often increases during colder months and decreases when days lengthen. Seasonal rhythms also influenced mobility. Food availability, migration routes, and water sources shifted across the year. These changes affected daily exertion and fatigue levels, which in turn shaped nighttime rest. There was no fixed bedtime across seasons. Instead, the environment adjusted biological timing. The circadian system evolved under these fluctuating light-dark cycles. Human physiology anticipates seasonal variation. In prehistoric contexts, rest aligned with these cycles rather than resisting them. Night expanded and contracted over the year. Sleep followed. There was no attempt to standardize darkness. It remained part of a larger rhythm, predictable, yet always changing. In mobile societies, Fire did not belong to a single location. Unlike later settled hearths built into permanent structures, prehistoric fires were temporary centers. They were constructed, maintained, and then left behind. Archaeological traces of ancient camps often reveal repeated but short-lived hearth sites. Ash layers, charcoal remains, and scorched earth indicate occupation, but not permanence. When a group moved, the fire did not travel as a fixed object. It was recreated. Carrying embers was possible over short distances, especially when relocation was near. In other cases, fire had to be produced again using friction, percussion, or preserved materials. This process required skill and planning. Fire in motion meant that the center of night shifted geographically. Each evening, a new circle of light formed. Each morning, it dissolved. Unlike modern lighting systems, which remain installed and predictable, prehistoric fire was situational. It depended on available fuel, on wind conditions, on terrain. The placement of a hearth influenced the arrangement of bodies around it. Its size affected visibility. Its duration shaped wakefulness. When the group departed, no permanent trace of warmth remained, only residual ash. The night did not stay anchored to one hearth. It followed the group. Fire was not infrastructure. It was practice. And through repetition of that practice, mobility retained continuity. Fire provided light, but it also created contrast. In open terrain, the illuminated area around a hearth became visible from a distance. While the circle of light increased safety within its boundary, it could also signal presence beyond it. Light produces shadow. The brighter the flame, the sharper the surrounding darkness appears. Objects at the edge of illumination become uncertain. Movement can be exaggerated or obscured. In prehistoric settings, this contrast required balance. A larger fire offered warmth and visibility. It also consumed more fuel and increased exposure. A smaller fire conserved resources, but narrowed the field of view. Anthropological research among mobile societies indicates that hearth placement often considers natural concealment. Trees, rocks, or elevation changes can reduce visibility from afar while preserving local light. Exposure was never eliminated. Night remained partially unknowable. The glow of flame did not extend far into the landscape. It defined a center while leaving margins intact. This dual condition shaped perception. Inside the circle, clarity. At the edge, ambiguity. Beyond, darkness. Rest occurred within that layered environment. Light offered stability, but it did not remove vulnerability. In motion across open land, fire required judgment. Visibility was an advantage and a risk. Night contained both. In settled societies, walls define space. They mark interior from exterior. They remain fixed across seasons. In mobile prehistoric life, walls were rare or temporary. Stability did not come from structure. It came from memory. Groups moving across known territories carried detailed mental maps of their environment. Archaeological patterns of repeated seasonal occupation suggest that certain locations were revisited over generations. Even when camps were temporary, the land itself was familiar. Rivers, ridgelines, distinctive rock formations, and tree clusters functioned as reference points. These features did not enclose space, but they organized it. At night, memory replaced architecture. Individuals remembered where hazards lay, where water flowed, where wind gathered, where the previous fire had burned. Sleeping in a new camp did not always mean sleeping in an unknown world. It meant re-entering a remembered landscape. Anthropological research among nomadic societies shows that spatial memory is often transmitted orally and experientially. Knowledge of terrain becomes intergenerational. Walls fix space physically. Memory fixes it cognitively. In the absence of permanent structures, familiarity created orientation. Night did not require enclosure to feel stable. It required recognition. Through repetition of movement and return, the landscape itself became dependable. Rest, therefore, depended not only on shelter, but on knowledge. Memory formed boundaries where walls did not exist. Mobility did not eliminate rest. It redefined it. In nomadic contexts, long periods of travel were common. Routes followed water sources, animal migrations, or seasonal vegetation. Movement required energy management. Rest did not occur only at night. Short pauses during the day allowed recovery. Shade under trees, protected rock faces, or natural depressions in terrain provided temporary relief from heat and exertion. Nighttime rest, therefore, was part of a larger cycle of exertion and pause. Unlike settled life, where activity and rest often follow fixed schedules, mobility produces flexible timing. If travel extended longer than expected, evening rest might be shortened. If resources were abundant, movement slowed and rest expanded. Anthropological research suggests that energy expenditure in mobile societies is closely aligned with environmental conditions. Daily effort varies with terrain and season. Sleep adjusts accordingly. There was no strict separation between work time and rest time. Both existed within a fluid rhythm. Fatigue accumulated differently across landscapes. Muscles responded to distance, weight, and climate. Rest restored not only strength, but orientation. Movement and stillness were not opposites. They were interdependent. Night did not interrupt travel, it punctuated it. In nomadic life, rest was embedded in motion, a recurring pause within a continuous journey. Mobility shaped prehistoric nights for tens of thousands of years. Rest followed movement. Fire was temporary, shelter was partial. Orientation depended on memory rather than walls. Over time, however, gradual shifts occurred. Archaeological evidence from the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods suggests increasing use of semi-permanent camps. Certain locations were occupied for longer durations. Structures became more stable. Storage appeared. This transition did not happen suddenly. It unfolded across generations. As food sources became more predictable, particularly with the gradual domestication of plants and animals, movement slowed. Night began to attach itself to place. When groups returned repeatedly to the same location, sleeping arrangements stabilized. Hearths became fixed. Ground surfaces were modified intentionally. The landscape was no longer only remembered, it was altered. With reduced mobility came a new relationship to enclosure. Temporary windbreaks became constructed walls. Roofs appeared. Interior and exterior began to separate more clearly. Night, which once followed the group across open terrain, now settled within defined boundaries. The sky was no longer always visible overhead. Fire became embedded within structure. Rest, once flexible and shifting, gradually became anchored. Nomadic night did not disappear. It transformed. From movement across land, human rest moved toward permanence, and with permanence, a different rhythm of night would emerge. For tens of thousands of years, mobility structured human life. Groups moved in response to seasons, animal migration, water availability, and plant cycles. Over time, this rhythm began to change. Archaeological evidence from the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods shows longer occupation of certain sites. Layers of repeated habitation suggest that some locations were revisited, not only seasonally, but for extended durations. This did not immediately produce permanent settlement. Movement continued, but its pace slowed. When food sources became more predictable through intensified gathering, early cultivation, or proximity to stable water, relocation required less frequency. Staying longer in one place altered daily patterns. Temporary shelters were reinforced, ground surfaces were leveled, refuse accumulated rather than disappearing with departure. Night began to attach itself to place more consistently. Instead of re-establishing sleeping arrangements each evening in a new location, groups returned to familiar ground. Repetition created spatial expectation. The night was no longer solely a pause within travel. It became part of an increasingly stable routine. Mobility did not end abruptly. It diminished gradually. As movement slowed, rest acquired a different texture. The landscape no longer shifted beneath the group as often. And with reduced motion, the experience of night began to change. As groups remained longer in particular locations, structures began to change. Temporary windbreaks and light shelters were gradually reinforced. Archaeological findings from early Neolithic sites reveal stone foundations, post holes, and compacted earth floors, indications of deliberate construction. These were not yet cities, they were modest dwellings. Walls appeared. Built space introduced a distinction that had previously been minimal, an interior separated from the surrounding environment. This separation did not eliminate exposure entirely. Roofs were simple. Openings allowed air and light to enter. Yet the boundary was intentional. Inside, the ground was leveled. Hearths were placed in fixed positions. Sleeping areas became more predictable. The structure held shape even after daylight ended. For the first time, night occurred within defined limits. The body no longer rested directly beneath open sky. It rested within a constructed perimeter. This change altered perception. Sound entered through openings rather than from all directions. Wind was partially blocked. Light from the fire reflected against walls instead of dispersing outward. Built space did not remove darkness, it framed it. The night was still present, but it was filtered. Through construction, humans began to shape not only their daytime environment, but their experience of rest. Walls did not simply enclose space, they reorganized it. With the construction of walls, a new distinction emerged. Interior and exterior became separate categories. Before built structures, The environment surrounded the resting body from all sides. Sound, wind, and temperature moved freely across space. Shelter moderated exposure, but rarely divided it completely. Walls introduced boundary. Inside, the ground was defined. Outside, terrain remained open. This separation altered perception of night. Darkness no longer arrived uniformly. It approached the structure from beyond its edges. Within an enclosed space, firelight reflected against surfaces. Shadows shortened. Visibility became more contained. Sound changed as well. Instead of arriving from every direction, it entered through openings, doorways, gaps, or roofs. The boundary filtered it. Interior space reduced exposure, but did not eliminate vulnerability. Structures were modest and often permeable. Yet the psychological shift was significant. The body rested within a defined perimeter. This perimeter created expectation. It allowed for repetition of arrangement. Sleeping positions became more stable from night to night. Exterior darkness remained, but it was now outside. Night began to acquire layers, an inner darkness within walls and a larger darkness beyond them. The environment was no longer continuous. It was divided, and through that division, the experience of rest gradually transformed. In mobile contexts, fire was recreated wherever the group stopped. Its position shifted with each camp. With settlement, the hearth became fixed. Archaeological excavations of early Neolithic dwellings reveal centrally placed fire pits that show repeated use over extended periods. Ash layers accumulate. Surrounding floors harden from heat and foot traffic. The hearth no longer dissolved each morning. It remained. This permanence altered the rhythm of night. Fire did not need to be rebuilt in a new location. Fuel was stored nearby. Its placement within the structure became predictable. Light reflected against walls and ceilings, intensifying brightness within the interior space. Smoke rose upward through openings or lingered beneath the roof. The hearth became an anchor. Sleeping areas arranged themselves around it. Daily life organized itself in relation to it. In earlier mobile settings, the fire marked a temporary center in darkness. Now, the center persisted. This stability reduced variability in nighttime experience. The same space warmed repeatedly. The same shadows formed on the same surfaces. Fire was no longer only practice, it was infrastructure. Night began to repeat itself in similar form. Through the fixed hearth, rest became anchored to a specific place. The center of light no longer moved with the group moved around it. Sleeping inside constructed space altered bodily experience. In earlier mobile contexts, the resting body remained directly exposed to shifting air, ground moisture, and open sky. With settlement, enclosure moderated these factors. Floors were prepared deliberately. Compacted earth, woven mats, animal skins, or layered plant material created insulation from cold ground. Over time, raised sleeping platforms appear in some regions. These adjustments reduced heat loss and stabilized posture. Inside structures, temperature fluctuations softened. Wind no longer reached the body with the same intensity. Rain did not directly disturb rest. Sound, too, changed character. Instead of dispersing outward, it reverberated within enclosed space. Voices were contained. Small movements were amplified. This altered the sensory texture of night. Rest became less exposed, but more acoustically defined. Archaeological patterns suggest that sleeping areas were often organized in consistent positions relative to hearth and wall. Repetition created familiarity. The body began to associate a specific place with rest. Enclosure did not remove vulnerability entirely. Structures were modest and permeable, yet the threshold between outside and inside introduced a new layer of predictability. Night was no longer entirely shared with the landscape. It was partially held within constructed space. Through this shift, rest gained stability, and stability reshaped rhythm. With settlement came the possibility of storing resources. In mobile societies, most materials had to be carried. Food was consumed close to the time it was gathered or hunted. Excess weight-limited movement. Early sedentary communities began to alter this pattern. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic sites reveals storage pits, clay vessels, and designated areas for keeping grain and dried foods. This development reduced the urgency of constant relocation. When food could be preserved, uncertainty decreased. Night no longer followed a day of immediate dependence on the next hunt or forage. Resources existed within reach. Storage altered psychological rhythm as well. Security expanded beyond the present moment. Tomorrow's survival did not depend solely on tomorrow's success. With reduced volatility in daily sustenance, rest could deepen. Sleeping within a space that contained provisions created continuity between days. Stability accumulated gradually. Walls enclosed space. Hearths fixed position. Stored materials anchored livelihood. Night began to occur within an environment that held memory, not only of place, but of surplus. The body rested in proximity to resources rather than scarcity. This shift did not eliminate risk, but it moderated it. Through storage, the unpredictability of movement diminished, and as uncertainty narrowed, the structure of night became more consistent. Rest aligned itself with permanence. As settlements expanded beyond single dwellings, night acquired a collective dimension once again. Early villages were composed of closely positioned structures. Archaeological sites such as Çatalhöyük and other Neolithic communities show clustered homes, shared walls, and narrow passages between buildings. Although sleep now occurred inside individual structures, proximity between households remained significant. Sound travelled across roofs and open courtyards. Smoke from hearths rose into shared air. Movement in one dwelling could be sensed by neighbours. Night was no longer entirely communal within a single circle of fire, yet it was not fully isolated either. Each household had its own hearth, its own sleeping space, its own interior boundary. At the same time, the village functioned as a larger organism. Paths connected entrances. Open spaces linked activity. Collective awareness extended beyond one dwelling. Anthropological comparisons suggest that in early agrarian communities, night often included residual interaction. Brief visits, shared watchfulness, or mutual attention to external sounds. The group expanded in scale but did not dissolve. Sleep became partially private. Rest occurred within walls. Yet beyond those walls, others rested nearby. Darkness settled over the village as a whole. Individual interiors glowed faintly with firelight. The night was no longer centered on a single hearth. It was distributed across many. With permanent structures, light changed behavior. In earlier open settings, firelight dispersed outward into darkness. Its glow marked a center visible across surrounding terrain. Inside constructed dwellings, light became enclosed. Walls reflected flame. Shadows shortened and multiplied across surfaces. The interior grew brighter relative to its size, while the exterior remained dark. This containment altered perception. Light no longer signaled presence over distance in the same way. It became local. The hearth illuminated walls, tools, stored materials, and sleeping areas within reach. Beyond doorways and roof openings, darkness remained intact. Smoke accumulated differently as well. Ventilation systems in early settlements were simple: roof openings or partial gaps. Fire required regulation within enclosed space. Flame size, fuel choice, and airflow demanded attention. This management refined nighttime practice. Light was no longer only warmth and protection, it was part of architecture. Within walls, illumination could be controlled more precisely. The boundary between lit and unlit space sharpened. Interior darkness and exterior darkness became distinct experiences. The night outside the dwelling was broad and atmospheric. The night inside was intimate and contained. Through enclosure, light became domesticated. It did not conquer darkness, it organized it, and within that organization, rest gained a new spatial clarity. When walls enclosed light, darkness changed character. In earlier mobile settings, night surrounded the resting body continuously. There was little separation between human space and environmental space. Darkness was uniform. With built structures, night became layered. There was darkness outside the dwelling, expansive and distant. And there was darkness inside, shaped by walls and openings. Interior shadows behaved differently. They followed corners and beams. They gathered near ceilings. They retreated when the hearth brightened. This distinction altered perception. Exterior darkness remained environmental. Interior darkness became architectural. The boundary between the two could be opened or closed. A doorway could frame night. A roof opening could reveal sky. The experience of vulnerability shifted accordingly. Inside walls, exposure lessened. Sound filtered through defined points. Movement beyond the structure felt more distant. This separation did not remove uncertainty, but it relocated it. Darkness was no longer continuous with the resting body. It was positioned beyond a threshold. Anthropologically, this shift marks an important transformation. When night becomes something outside, interior space acquires a different psychological stability. Rest begins to occur within enclosure rather than within landscape. The night remains, but it is now divided, and through division, its meaning changes. As settlement stabilized space, it also began to stabilize time. In mobile societies, daily rhythm was shaped directly by light, terrain, and movement. Night followed travel. Rest followed fatigue. With settlement, repetition intensified. The same hearth burned in the same location. The same walls enclosed the same interior. The same paths connected neighboring dwellings. Agriculture strengthened this regularity. Planting and harvesting required attention to seasonal cycles. Observation of sunrise positions, lunar phases, and seasonal shifts became increasingly important. Time was no longer only experienced, it was monitored. Early communities developed ways to anticipate change through memory, through observation, and eventually through simple calendrical systems. Night within settlement became more predictable. Evening tasks repeated. Food preparation followed routine. Sleeping arrangements stabilized. Gradually, darkness was integrated into structured daily life rather than simply marking its boundary. The shift was subtle. Night did not lose its environmental character, but it became embedded within organized activity. Space had been enclosed. Now time began to acquire shape. From mobility to settlement, from open sky to interior walls, rest had already transformed. With the structuring of time, it would transform again. The night that once followed the landscape would begin to follow schedule. Long before mechanical clocks or written calendars, the sky functioned as a visible measure of change. The rising and setting of the sun provided the most immediate structure. Its path across the horizon shifted gradually over the year. Day length expanded and contracted with the seasons. These patterns were observable without instruments. The moon offered a different rhythm. Its phases, new, crescent, full, and waning, followed a consistent cycle of approximately 29.5 days. This regularity made it one of the earliest natural markers of time. Archaeological evidence suggests that Upper Paleolithic communities recognized lunar repetition. Notches on bone artifacts and symbolic markings may reflect awareness of cyclical counting, although interpretation remains debated. Seasonal stars also contributed to orientation. Certain constellations appeared at predictable times of year. In agrarian societies that emerged later, heliacal risings, when a star becomes visible just before sunrise, were used to anticipate planting or flooding cycles. Observation did not require abstraction. Repeated exposure to sky patterns created expectation. When daylight shortened, winter approached. When certain stars returned, seasons shifted. Night, therefore, was not only darkness, it was information. The sky became a reference surface upon which time moved visibly. Without clocks, communities relied on recurrence. Through careful watching, patterns emerged. And through those patterns, time acquired structure, long before it was measured mechanically. With the development of agriculture, time became more consequential. For mobile foragers, food availability shifted with landscape and season. Movement allowed adaptation. For early agricultural communities, crops required waiting. Planting occurred within specific seasonal windows. Harvest depended on timing. Rainfall, frost, and sunlight influenced yield. This created anticipation. Daily activity became tied to longer cycles of preparation and return. Fields demanded repeated attention. Irrigation systems, where present, required monitoring. Unlike mobile subsistence strategies, agriculture reduced flexibility. It anchored communities to land. The sun's position at planting season mattered. The length of day indicated transition. The moon's cycle informed counting between stages of growth. Archaeological evidence from early farming sites shows granaries, field systems, and irrigation channels, signs of organized planning. Planning implies temporal awareness. Night, in this context, no longer followed only fatigue or environmental change. It followed labor patterns. Evening marked completion of work in fields. Morning marked resumption. Rest aligned itself with agricultural rhythm. Seasonal repetition intensified regularity. Work cycles structured days. Days accumulated into predictable phases. Time was not yet mechanical, but it was managed. The natural world still governed it, yet human activity increasingly synchronized with expectation. Through cultivation, night entered a more organized system. Rest became part of production's cycle, no longer only environmental pause, but scheduled recovery. As daily routines stabilized through settlement and agriculture, the transition between day and night became more distinct. In earlier mobile contexts, activity faded gradually with light. There was little formal separation between late day and early night. With structured labor, evening gained definition. Fieldwork concluded at predictable intervals. Animals were secured. Tools were stored. Food preparation followed established patterns. These repeated actions marked a recognizable shift. Evening became a phase rather than a simple fading of daylight. Archaeological and ethnographic studies of agrarian societies indicate that communal meals, maintenance of hearths, and household tasks often clustered in this period between work and rest. The decline of light no longer served as the only signal for cessation. Completion of daily obligations also indicated transition. This created layered timing. Environmental darkness approached from outside. Social routine concluded from within. The convergence of these two signals, natural and social, gave evening structure. Over time, expectation formed. Individuals anticipated the sequence of events: return from field, meal, fire maintenance, rest. Evening became a threshold. It did not yet follow a clock, but it followed order. Through repetition, a shared understanding of when the day ends emerged. Night was no longer solely environmental condition. It became part of a daily schedule, recognized, anticipated, and collectively observed. As communities settled and routines stabilized, night began to host repeated symbolic activity. Ritual did not require monumental architecture, it required recurrence. Archaeological sites from the Neolithic period show designated areas within settlements for communal gathering. Some structures appear to have been used for purposes beyond daily subsistence, marked by unusual artifacts, symbolic decoration, or atypical spatial arrangement. Evening provided a practical setting for shared attention. Labor had concluded. The community gathered within visible range of hearthlight. Darkness outside reinforced enclosure. Repetition gave meaning. Certain actions performed at similar times. Seasonal observances, offerings, shared meals, storytelling, or structured silence became embedded within nightly rhythm. Ritual does not necessarily imply formal religion in its early stages. It suggests patterned behavior that reinforces collective identity. Night, with reduced external distraction, intensified focus. Firelight directed attention inward. Shadows shaped perception. Sound carried differently in still air. Anthropological comparisons indicate that low light conditions often enhance symbolic interpretation. Shared experience in darkness fosters cohesion. Through repeated practice, night became more than recovery from labor. It became a space of alignment. Environmental darkness remained, but social intention filled it. Ritual introduced another layer to time. Evening was not only the end of work. It became a recurring moment of shared orientation, predictable, structured, and remembered. Before mechanical clocks, time was observed rather than counted precisely. The position of the sun offered the most immediate measure. Its height in the sky indicated progression through the day. Shadow length changed gradually, providing visual reference without instruments. Simple vertical markers, posts, stones, or architectural edges could cast predictable shadows. While early sundials appear later in recorded history, the principle of shadow observation preceded formal devices. The moon provided longer cycles. Its phases allowed approximate counting of nights between events. In agrarian contexts, lunar repetition helped structure planting and harvesting intervals. Seasonal changes in daylight length offered broader markers. Long nights indicated winter, short nights indicated summer. Anthropological research suggests that many pre-industrial societies describe time in relation to natural events rather than abstract numbers. Expressions such as "when the sun reaches that ridge" or "after the second moon" reflect observational timing. Night, therefore, was not measured in hours. It was recognized by sequence. Early night, middle night, and pre-dawn each had distinct qualities. Temperature shifts, changes in sound, and variation in darkness. These distinctions required attention rather than devices. Time moved visibly across sky and landscape. Measurement remained approximate. Precision was unnecessary. What mattered was alignment. Through observation, communities synchronized activity with recurring patterns. Time did not tick, it unfolded, and night followed its unfolding without division into numbered hours. As settlements grew, daily timing became increasingly collective. In small mobile groups, variation in sleep and wake cycles could remain flexible. In villages, proximity intensified coordination. Agricultural labor required simultaneous effort. Fields were planted together. Harvests involved multiple households. Irrigation, storage, and protection of crops depended on cooperation. This cooperation extended into night. Evening routines began to align across households. Hearths were tended at similar times. Meals were prepared within overlapping intervals. Quiet settled gradually across the settlement rather than randomly. Anthropological observations in agrarian communities show that shared rhythm reduces friction. When work begins and ends collectively, expectation stabilizes. Night, therefore, became part of communal timing. Individual rest no longer followed only personal fatigue. It followed social pattern. The village as a whole slowed together. Light diminished across multiple dwellings. Sound decreased collectively. While each household retained its interior boundary, synchronization connected them. A shared schedule does not require written rules. It emerges through repetition. Children learned when evening approached. Adults anticipated return from fields. Neighbors adjusted to one another's rhythms. Through this alignment, time became social. Night was no longer only environmental darkness. It was a coordinated interval. Rest occurred not in isolation, but in relation to others, even across walls. In earlier phases of human life, rhythm was primarily environmental. Light and darkness determined activity. Temperature influenced movement. Season shaped availability of food. With settlement and agriculture, another layer emerged. Rhythm became social. The sun still rose and set. The seasons still turned. But human activity began to follow shared expectation rather than immediate environmental demand. Work did not always stop solely because darkness arrived. It stopped because tasks were complete. It began because obligation required it. Time gradually shifted from observation to coordination. Agrarian societies depended on cooperation. Cooperation required synchronization. Individuals aligned their waking hours with communal need. Rest followed collective timing. This shift did not replace environmental rhythm. It overlaid it. Night continued to bring darkness and cooler air. Yet its role within daily life expanded beyond natural pause. It became part of a pattern agreed upon through repetition. Even without mechanical clocks, villages moved through shared phases of activity and rest. The transition from environmental to social rhythm marked a subtle transformation. Humans began to regulate themselves in relation to one another. Darkness remained constant. What changed was response. Night was no longer only a condition imposed from outside. It was an interval negotiated within community. As routines stabilized and rhythms aligned socially, the idea of beginnings and endings became more defined. In earlier mobile contexts, transitions were gradual. Light faded, movement slowed, rest emerged without clear division. With settlement and agricultural labor, distinctions sharpened. Morning marked the start of collective activity. Evening marked its conclusion. These boundaries were not yet measured by mechanical devices, but they were recognized. Anthropological studies of early agrarian communities indicate that daily life became segmented into phases: fieldwork, food preparation, maintenance, rest. Each phase implied a temporal limit. When work concluded, evening began. When light strengthened, morning resumed. This conceptual framing introduced structure. Time acquired edges. Night was no longer simply the absence of daylight. It was a defined interval between two socially acknowledged points. Boundaries do not require clocks, they require agreement. Repeated recognition of start and end creates expectation. Expectation creates order. Over generations, such order becomes habitual. The human mind begins to anticipate sequence rather than simply react to environment. Through this process, night gained definition not only as darkness, but as duration, a beginning, a middle, an end. And with boundaries established, time became something that could be organized more deliberately. As temporal boundaries became clearer, night gradually assumed the character of a defined interval. It was no longer only the environmental condition that followed sunset. It became a predictable phase within daily structure. In settled communities, obligations during daylight hours created contrast. Work, maintenance, and cooperation required coordination. When these activities concluded, night marked the transition into regulated rest. Regulation did not mean strict enforcement. It meant expectation. Certain activities ceased. Others occurred repeatedly in similar sequence. Evening tasks prepared the household for withdrawal from labor. Anthropological observations of early agrarian societies suggest that night increasingly functioned as a shared pause. Households quieted within comparable timeframes. Village sound diminished collectively. Rest, therefore, became more synchronized than in earlier mobile contexts. Sleep did not simply follow fatigue, it followed order. The interval of darkness was now framed by routine. Within this interval, variability remained. Individuals still woke intermittently. Seasonal differences persisted, yet the overarching structure held. Night was anticipated. It arrived within a system of organized activity and organized cessation, from environmental rhythm to social rhythm, and from social rhythm to temporal boundary. Night had acquired regulation. It remained natural darkness, but it had become part of deliberate timing. By the time settlements stabilized and temporal boundaries formed, night had already transformed significantly. It was no longer solely environmental darkness. It was organized interval. It was anticipated and collectively observed. Yet one fundamental limitation remained. Light was still bound to flame. Hearths, oil lamps, torches, these sources extended visibility only modestly. They required fuel. They demanded attention. Their range was limited. Even in settled villages, darkness retained authority over the wider landscape. Interior space could be illuminated briefly. Exterior space remained largely untouched. Activity after sunset remained constrained by resource availability and practical limits. The night, though structured socially, still followed natural duration. Its length varied seasonally. Its onset followed the sun. However, gradual refinements in lighting technology began to appear across different regions. Improved oil lamps, enclosed flame holders, and later, more efficient fuels. These developments did not immediately dissolve darkness, but they began to stretch its usable margins. Evening tasks could continue slightly longer. Interior spaces could sustain activity beyond immediate necessity. The boundary between day and night softened incrementally. Night, once governed almost entirely by environment, had become social and partially technical. The next transformation would not alter the sky. It would alter duration. When light became more controllable and portable, night itself would extend. And with extension, human rhythm would shift again. For much of settled life, the hearth remained fixed at the center of the dwelling. Its flame illuminated a defined interior space. Beyond that space, darkness continued largely unchanged. Over time, however, light began to move. Archaeological evidence from ancient Mediterranean, Near Eastern, and later European sites shows the development of portable oil lamps and handheld torches. These devices allowed flame to detach from the hearth. Light no longer had to remain anchored to a single pit in the floor. Clay lamps fueled by animal fat or plant oil provided steadier and more controlled illumination than open fire. Their small size made them transportable within interior space. A person could carry light from one area of a dwelling to another. In some cases, light could extend briefly into exterior areas, courtyards, entrances, or pathways. This mobility altered the texture of night. Illumination became selective rather than centralized. Instead of gathering exclusively around one fixed center, individuals could reposition brightness according to need. Portable flame did not eliminate darkness. It fragmented it. Small zones of light could be created temporarily, then extinguished. The boundary between lit and unlit space became adjustable. With this adjustment, activity after sunset expanded slightly. Night remained dominant, yet for the first time, light began to follow intention more directly. The hearth had anchored rest to place. Portable flame allowed light to follow the human hand. And with that movement, night began to loosen. As lighting technologies improved, flame became more stable. Early oil lamps, fueled by olive oil in the Mediterranean or animal fat in colder regions, produced a steadier glow than open hearths or torches. Clay lamp designs evolved to control airflow and wick placement, increasing efficiency and reducing smoke. Later, beeswax candles and tallow candles introduced additional refinement. Wax burned more cleanly than animal fat. Candles were portable, contained, and measurable. Their length indicated approximate duration. Light gained predictability. Instead of relying solely on gathered wood or open flame, households could prepare fuel in advance. Evening illumination could be extended intentionally. This extension was gradual. Fuel remained limited and costly in many regions. Candles required labor. Oil required cultivation or trade. Yet compared to earlier reliance on the central hearth, these technologies allowed more precise management of brightness and time. Illumination could now be sustained for specific tasks: repair work, writing, craft production, quiet reading in later periods. Night did not vanish, but its edges softened. The difference between late afternoon and early evening became less abrupt. Controlled light introduced a new layer of agency. Darkness was still present beyond walls and beyond the reach of flame. Yet within defined spaces it could be delayed. Through oil and wax, night began to stretch. Not dramatically, but deliberately. As portable and controlled light became more available, night slowly expanded beyond essential tasks. In earlier periods, activity after sunset was largely practical: securing animals, maintaining fire, preparing food. With steadier lamps and candles, certain forms of work and reflection could continue. Craft production sometimes extended into evening hours. Textile work, tool repair, and domestic preparation could occur under contained light. In literate societies, especially in later classical and medieval periods, reading and writing by lamplight became possible. Manuscript culture in monasteries, for example, depended on controlled illumination during darker hours. This did not transform night immediately into day. Fuel remained limited, light remained localized. Visibility was still constrained, yet intention shifted. Evening could now host activity not strictly required for immediate survival. Conversation extended slightly longer. Household organization continued beyond sunset. Anthropological studies suggest that when light allows optional continuation of work or interaction, daily rhythm begins to stretch. Fatigue no longer determines cessation alone. Capability influences it. Night retained its cooling temperature and environmental darkness. But within interior spaces, its duration became more flexible. The boundary between necessity and choice widened. Illumination made possible a subtle redefinition of time. Rest was still expected. Darkness was still present. Yet the decision of when to withdraw from activity began to loosen. Night did not disappear. It lengthened. As light extended slightly beyond necessity, evening began to reorganize socially. In earlier agrarian settings, dusk marked withdrawal from labor. Households quieted gradually. Night followed routine. With steadier illumination, gathering could continue in more deliberate form. Interior spaces accommodated longer conversation, storytelling, shared reflection, or planning, extended into hours previously constrained by fading light. In medieval towns and later early modern settings, records suggest that evening assemblies, domestic craft work, and limited commercial activity occurred under lamplight or candlelight. This expansion did not create uniform nightlife. Fuel cost restricted duration. Lighting remained localized. Darkness still dominated public space in many regions. Yet within illuminated interiors, social rhythm shifted. Evening acquired texture beyond transition. It became a zone of interaction rather than only cessation. The social meaning of night diversified. It could be communal within enclosed rooms. It could be contemplative. It could support focused tasks requiring quiet. Anthropological observations indicate that when light permits continued gathering, group cohesion can deepen through shared extended time. Night remained distinct from day, but it no longer signaled immediate dispersal. Through extended illumination, evening became layered. It was still darkness outside. Inside, it could be structured, inhabited, and intentionally prolonged. And with that prolongation, daily rhythm adjusted once more. As lighting technologies improved, access to illumination did not distribute evenly. Oil required cultivation, trade, or animal resources. Beeswax candles demanded labor and materials that were often limited. In many regions, high-quality candles were expensive commodities. This introduced differentiation. Households with greater resources could extend evening activity longer. They could afford cleaner-burning wax rather than smoky tallow. They could illuminate larger interior spaces. Less affluent households remained closer to natural darkness. Fuel was conserved. Flame was used briefly and extinguished early. Historical records from medieval Europe, the Islamic world, and parts of East Asia indicate variation in domestic lighting based on status and occupation. Monasteries, courts, and wealthy homes maintained longer hours of illumination. Rural dwellings often relied on minimal light. Light, therefore, became a marker, not only of visibility, but of capacity. Extended night required resources. Access to prolonged activity after sunset signaled economic position. This did not eliminate darkness from any community, Even the most illuminated interiors were modest by modern standards. Yet the experience of night diverged. For some, evening allowed sustained conversation, reading, or planning. For others, rest followed sunset more closely. Darkness remained universal, but its management began to vary. Through stratification of light, night ceased to be identical across households. It became differentiated, not only by environment, but by means. For most of human history, the boundary between day and night was abrupt. Sunset reduced visibility quickly, activity narrowed, darkness asserted itself. With portable lamps and candles, this boundary began to soften. Light did not eliminate night, but it extended certain elements of daytime into evening hours. Work could continue briefly. Conversation lengthened. Tasks once limited to daylight migrated into later intervals. This migration altered perception. Instead of a clear transition from visibility to obscurity, there was a gradual shift. Interior spaces remained active while exterior darkness deepened. Over time, this partial extension reshaped expectation. Evening no longer signaled immediate cessation, it suggested possibility. Historical accounts from late medieval and early modern towns describe craftsmen, scholars, and merchants who worked by candlelight beyond sunset, particularly during winter months when daylight was brief. Such practices did not create uniform schedules. Fuel cost and fatigue still constrained duration. Yet the psychological boundary shifted. Day and night were no longer strictly opposed. They overlapped. The environment continued its cycle unchanged. The sun still set. But human rhythm began to decouple slightly from that setting. Night remained natural darkness. Yet within illuminated interiors, its authority diminished incrementally. The line between light and dark thinned, and through that thinning daily structure began to stretch. As towns expanded into early urban centres, night acquired a more public dimension. In rural settlements, darkness fell primarily over private dwellings. In growing cities, streets, markets, and administrative spaces extended social life beyond individual households. Pre-industrial cities did not resemble modern illuminated environments, yet limited forms of public lighting began to appear. Historical records from ancient Rome mention oil lamps placed along certain streets. In medieval Islamic cities, lanterns sometimes illuminated main thoroughfares during festivals or significant events. By the late Middle Ages in parts of Europe, municipal authorities required residents to hang lanterns outside during specific hours. These practices were inconsistent and localized. They did not create continuous brightness. However, they marked a shift. Night became partially civic. Urban density intensified sound and movement after sunset. Night watchmen patrolled streets. Gates were closed at set times. Curfews structured movement. Darkness remained extensive, yet it was no longer entirely unregulated. The city introduced collective management of night. Interior light had already extended evening activity. Public measures now extended awareness into shared space. The boundary between private and public darkness shifted. Night was not fully conquered, but it was increasingly organized. Within early urban centers, darkness coexisted with administration, and through that coexistence, human rhythm approached another transformation. As light became more controllable, night began to change, not only practically, but psychologically. For most of human history, darkness was experienced as dominant. It defined limits. It required withdrawal. With portable lamps, candles, and limited urban lighting, darkness no longer arrived as an immediate boundary. It became negotiable. Interior spaces could resist it briefly. Public streets could be partially illuminated. Evening activity could extend beyond necessity. This did not eliminate fear or uncertainty, but it modified expectation. When light can be produced at will, within limits, darkness loses some of its inevitability. Historical accounts from early modern Europe describe increasing evening sociability in certain urban settings: coffee houses, taverns, reading circles. These spaces depended on sustained interior illumination. The night was no longer solely a pause imposed by environment. It became a field partially shaped by intention. This shift affected perception of time. If activity can continue after sunset, sunset ceases to be the definitive end of the day. The mind begins to experience night as flexible. Darkness remains outside the reach of flame. Yet inside illuminated zones, its authority weakens. Through incremental technological refinement, human beings moved closer to altering rhythm itself. Night was still natural, but it was no longer unquestioned, and in that questioning, another transformation approached. By the late pre-industrial period, night had already shifted in measurable ways. Flame was portable. Light could be sustained deliberately. Urban centers managed limited public illumination. Yet one fundamental constraint remained. Light still required combustion. Oil, wax, and fuel imposed boundaries. Smoke, cost, and fire risk restricted scale. Darkness continued to reclaim most of the landscape after sunset, but human expectation had changed. Evening was no longer simply environmental withdrawal, it was adjustable within limits. In the 17th and 18th centuries, larger cities in Europe experimented with coordinated street lighting systems, lanterns mounted at intervals and maintained by municipal order. Paris and London, for example, introduced more systematic night illumination before the advent of electricity. These systems were modest compared to modern standards. Light pools were isolated and dim. Shadows remained extensive. Still, a psychological threshold was crossed. If streets can be lit consistently, night becomes partially engineered. The sky did not change. The sun still set. But human infrastructure began to resist that setting more assertively. On the edge of electrical light, darkness had not disappeared. It had thinned. Night was still natural, yet it was increasingly mediated. The transformation that followed would not merely extend evening, it would restructure daily life. And with artificial daylight, the balance between rest and activity would shift again. For most of human history, night was not a problem to solve. It was an environment to inhabit. In prehistoric landscapes, darkness structured movement. It shaped rest. It required proximity and fire. As communities formed, night became collective. As settlements stabilized, it became enclosed. As agriculture intensified, it became structured in time. With oil and wax, it began to extend. With early cities, it became organized. With advancing technologies, it approached transformation. Across thousands of years, the sky did not change. The sun continued to set. The moon continued its cycle. Stars followed their patterns. What changed was human response. At first, night imposed rhythm. Later, humans negotiated with it. Eventually, they began to engineer it. Sleep, in its earliest form, followed environment directly. Fatigue met darkness. Rest met silence. Over time, sleep became scheduled. It adjusted to labor, to ritual, to social coordination. As light grew more controllable, the boundary between day and night softened. The natural pause that once defined human rhythm became increasingly adjustable. Yet the biological system that evolved under ancient skies remains. The human circadian rhythm still responds to light and darkness. Hormonal cycles still follow patterns shaped long before cities existed. In modern life, artificial illumination has extended night beyond its historical form. But beneath electric light, the body still carries memory of older rhythms. Prehistoric night was expansive. Settled night was structured. Early urban night was managed. Each transformation altered perception. The question is not whether night changed. It clearly did. The question is how much of the original rhythm remains within us. When light fills streets continuously, darkness becomes rare. When schedules override sunset, rest becomes negotiated. Across history, night moved from environment to enclosure, to regulation to extension. And now, in the present, it is almost optional. Yet the human body has not abandoned its inheritance. It still expects darkness. It still prepares for rest. Long before clocks, before cities, before artificial light, night defined the pace of life. And even now, beneath modern illumination, that older rhythm remains quietly present.